Hello all, today we're going to be talking about government regulation. So we've been looking at the different type of market structures. What we're going to focus on today is when the government gets involved. So sometimes these markets do not operate very fairly or in the best interest for us as consumers, and we're going to take a look at the ways that the government might intervene through regulations or the way a government might deregulate and take off some regulations to try to make the market more competitive. Before we do that, though, I wanted to review the concepts from the previous lessons assignment. So if you have completed that, or if you had some questions on it and you want to pause this video and open up your assignment from yesterday, I'm going to really briefly go over the 4 types of monopolies and what each one of them means, because it is important for you to understand the difference between them. So in the previous lessons assignment, you were supposed to read about patents, government licenses, natural monopolies, and copyright and trademark. And again, I'm just going to go over really quickly what each of them are. To start with, in the top left corner, we have patents. A patent is a type of monopoly where you are given sole control of a particular invention. So if you have come up with a new idea or a new invention, you can apply to the US government for them to give you a patent. And you can see in this picture, Lego, for example, has a patent on the Lego toy figure. So they came up with this original idea for a Lego toy figure, and you can kind of see how they have designed it and what the example is of what they are patenting. And then you are the only one who is allowed to produce that particular good for 17 years. The government gives you a patent for 17 years. So anyone who produced a similar Lego figure within those 17 years would have been violating the monopoly that the Lego company had over the toy figure. Now, the reason the government does that is because it wants people to come up with new ideas and new inventions. And so they are going to encourage you to come up with something new, and they don't want someone to just immediately steal that idea from you, okay? Because then why would you invest your time and your energy and your money in coming up with a new idea if someone could just immediately steal it? So they give you 17 years for you to establish yourself, to build your business, to get people to buy your product, and then after those 17 years, other people can get into the market. So now Lego has had this patent for a very long time, since 1979. Now there are other more generic companies that can produce similar Lego figures, but Lego was able to establish itself as the primary block building company, and they still have a huge dominance over that market, in part because they were given that patent. Okay, so if you have an invention and the government says you've got 17 years to be the only person to sell it, you have a monopoly through a patent. Okay, the next one that's listed up there at the top right is a government license. A government license is when the government is giving you a specific license to have a monopoly over a particular good or service. So an example of that is the United States Postal Service. The government has said the United States Postal Service is going to be the exclusive deliverer of mail. Okay, if you want to send a letter, you can send a letter through the Postal Service, the United States Postal Service, and that is it. Okay, so the government has granted them a monopoly through a license. We also see this happening a lot within, I think the example they gave you in the reading was like in a sports arena. If you have a hot dog, if you're a hot dog vendor, they could give you a license to have a monopoly over the hot dog industry within that sports arena. Okay, there might be hundreds of other hot dog vendors, but in that particular place, you have a monopoly over it. So I also think, movie theaters, they have concession stands. They have a monopoly over the concessions in that movie theater. Okay, they have a permission to operate with no other competition just within the movie theater. That's where we see government license come into play with a monopoly. On the bottom left, we have natural monopolies. Natural monopoly, I mentioned this in the very first set of notes that we had, is when it is not feasible to have a different or more than one company producing a particular good. So I think the best example is electricity. Electrical companies have a monopoly over your home because it's not feasible to send in electrical lines to every single house from 10 different suppliers. And so there's only going to be one. and the government says electrical companies are allowed to have a monopoly over individual houses. Okay, the same thing would be true then for like natural gas, if they're running natural gas lines into your home. And then also I think the example they gave you in the reading was the subway system in New York. Okay, if you're in New York or in London or Chicago, there really can only be one major subway system. You can't have dozens and dozens and dozens of different subways running into each other, and so it's not feasible. It's not practical. You don't have the ability to have more than one, and so they have a monopoly over the subway system. And then lastly are copyright and trademark. Copyright and trademark are kind of similar to patents in that you have a particular logo or brand, or maybe you have a movie or a song. This protects you so that nobody can repeat and copy the logo, brand, or song that you have. So the McDonald's arches, for example, the image of the McDonald's arches is copyrighted and trademarked, and nobody can steal that same image. So you have a monopoly over the image. Or a movie, we can't copyright. You can't just record a movie off of TV and then sell it as your own. They have a copyright over the movie. So they have a monopoly over the movie. So those are the types of different monopolies. Again, if you need to go back and review your assignment or relook at it, or even resubmit it kind of with this new information, feel free to do so. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today then is government regulation and deregulation, the ways in which the government controls these different market structures. So the definition of regulations are the rules administered by the government to influence economic activity by determining prices, product standards, and the conditions under which new firms may enter an industry. So really what the government is looking at, is there a problem? And what is that problem? Is there some kind of problem within the market? And do we need a regulation to solve the problem? And if the answer is yes to that, then what kinds of regulations and how would that help solve the problem? And does that create any new or additional problems? So again, if you're looking at a market and you've got a monopoly, for example, what should the government do about that monopoly? And should they try to regulate those monopolies that exist? And does that create any additional problems? Are there any other things that could happen if those monopolies continue, or if we put regulations on them? Okay, and again, anytime during these notes, feel free to pause if you need to write additional information. Remember, you should have the notes outline for these notes up and filling them out as you listen, and then make sure that you turn those notes outline in to Schoology once you are done. Okay, so there are two different types of government regulations. One is called an economic regulation, which is government regulation of business practices, so how the businesses actually operate within that market. And the second type of government regulation is a social regulation, where the government is looking to regulate to make sure the products that people are selling are safe and that they are up to standard or code as far as what they're actually saying they will do. And I'll give you examples of both of those types of regulations. So the first type of regulations are called antitrust laws, which are federal and state government laws that regulate the conduct and organization of business corporations, generally to promote fair competition for the benefits of consumers. Really, that name, an antitrust law, trust is another name for a monopoly. So an antitrust law is really an anti-monopoly law. Again, we don't tend to like monopolies. Monopolies can produce oftentimes really poor products and charge really high prices because they have no competition. In general, competition is good for the economy. It's good for us as consumers because when you have other competitors, you have to produce the best product possible at the cheapest cost possible. And when there's a monopoly and there's no competition, it means you're not producing the best product and you're not going to have the cheapest price. So the government is going to try to break up monopolies when it can so that those monopolies no longer have sole control and that they are competing with one another. So a lot of times both monopolies and oligopolies can be bad for the economy and for the consumer. because they tend to have higher prices and lower output than markets with many sellers. And we've got a lot of examples of this, like Kodak in 1954, AT&T in 1974, Microsoft in the late 90s and early 2000s is another one, where the government will actually sue these companies, file a lawsuit against the companies, and if they can prove that they are monopolies that are bad, that are harming consumers, they can force those companies to break up into smaller companies so that they no longer are a monopoly or have control. So an antitrust law is an anti-monopoly law, trying to break up monopolies into smaller companies that compete with each other. One of the reasons for this is because oftentimes monopolies will conduct what we call predatory pricing. Predatory pricing is when companies are pricing goods or services at such a low level that other suppliers cannot compete and are forced to leave the market. So this kind of goes against what we would expect, because we expect monopolies to charge really high prices, but sometimes monopolies charge really, really low prices, because then everybody's going to shop or buy from that particular company, and that will cause all other companies to go out of business. So a lot of times you can see my examples down there of Walmart and Amazon. Walmart and Amazon have frequently been accused of predatory pricing, where they come into a community and they charge super low prices, or people are going to buy just from them at really, really low prices. And all of the local companies that produce those same goods will end up going out of business because they can't compete at those really low prices. So, for example, this has happened a lot when Amazon first came into the market of selling books. A lot of local bookstores ended up going out of business, and the only place you could buy books then in one community was from Amazon. So it's a way for them to create a monopoly, because they are destroying all other businesses by charging really, really low prices. And then they're the only company left. So the government, again, can sometimes file antitrust lawsuits against companies that are using predatory pricing, saying that it's a monopoly practice, or that it's non-competitive, or it's forcing their competitors out of the market. So here are some examples of that. The top article says 4 ways Amazon's ruthless practices are crushing local economies. Amazon's predatory pricing has been questioned, and the same thing with Walmart. Walmart has been charged with predatory pricing in multiple lawsuits that say that they go into communities, charge super, super low prices as a way to eliminate their competition. And we don't want that. We want competition. Competition is good. Once Walmart goes into a community and destroys their competition, they can then easily raise their prices and sell inferior products. So competition is good. And that's not to say every Walmart has done this or that it does this to every community, but what we want is competition. We want companies to compete against one another, because that's going to be good for the types of products that they're producing, and it's going to be good for the prices for consumers. Okay, the next part here is why, again, looking at why does the government intervene? And one of the reasons the government intervenes is because of something we call externalities. An externality, as it's defined in the second bullet point, is a cost or benefit associated with this production or consumption of a product that spills over to third parties. Third parties are people other than the direct producers and consumers of the product. So what we're looking at here is sometimes governments regulate not because the particular business itself is harmful, but because of how it's harming other people not directly involved. Or in some cases, we might want to promote it because it's helping other people not directly involved in the business. So a negative externality is when there's a negative side effect that results when the production or consumption of a good or service affects the welfare of people who are not directly involved in the market exchange. So I was actually just talking to my husband about this the other day, because he works for Minnesota Power, which is a coal-burning power plant, and there are regulations on Minnesota Power about how they can produce their power. And those regulations are not because the using coal affects the workers or the business, it's because burning coal can affect the people in the community, that it's going to increase pollution, and that pollution can affect everybody in the community, even if they're not directly connected to Minnesota Power. So the government is going to regulate those industries, put laws in place that affect how they are producing that power. I always think of, none of you have probably seen this movie. There's a movie called Erin Brockovich with Julia Roberts. You should look it up. It's really good. And one of the things that it's based on a true story of a woman who investigates a company whose chemicals are leaking into the groundwater. And the people who live in that community drink the water and then they develop cancer as a result. So if you can show that the actions of a company is having a direct impact on people outside of the company that have nothing to do with the company, then you might pass regulations because of the negative externality. In the same sense, we want to promote positive externalities, which are positive side effects that affect the welfare of people who are not directly involved in the market. So, for example, if you can, maybe there's a house in a neighborhood that looks really bad or is run down or hasn't been lived in. If you can promote businesses who take over those homes and renovate them and resell them, that would not only benefit the company and the person who buys that house, but it would affect the whole neighborhood because now the values of the homes in the whole neighborhood will go up as a result. So there's things the government can do to try to encourage positive externalities and try to limit negative externalities with the types of regulations and laws that they pass. So some examples of government regulation. Again, some of these are social regulations where we're trying to look for the benefits to consumers to make sure consumers aren't harmed. So for example, that first one in the 1950s, there was a drug called thalidomide that was sold as a sleeping pill. But when they did a study on pregnant women, they found that it led to really bad birth defects in their babies. So the government then passes a regulation to increase the Food and Drug Administration's authority to control new drugs into the market. So now the government's saying, you know what, we need to regulate prescription drugs and make sure that they are safe, and the Food and Drug Administration will make sure and that they are safe for consumers, that we're not going to just sell things just to sell them. Okay, the same thing, 1965, Ralph Nader wrote a book called Unsafe at Any Speed, and what they found was that the example they gave was the Chevrolet Corvair, that it had flaws in its design that made it really dangerous to drive. And so the government establishes the National Highway and Traffic Safety Administration, which leads to a bunch of automobile safety regulations. I always give the example, my dad used to always tell a story. There were 9 kids in my dad's family growing up in the 1950s, and they essentially packed all 9 kids in the back seat, maybe 8 kids in the back seat, and the youngest one sat on his mom's lap in the front seat. There were no seat belts. There were no car seats at the time. And what they realized was that was dangerous and unsafe, and that was bad for consumers. And so the government has passed regulations that mandate that people that kids have to ride in the back seat, that you have to use car seats. Those are things that didn't exist, but because of the dangers, those are laws that now exist. That's an example of a government regulation. And the last one down there too, about kids sleeping in flammable pajamas, kids eating lead paint, led to something called the Consumer Product Safety Commission that introduced regulations for as far as like widths for slats on a baby crib. Baby cribs, they have those little slats that are on the side, and there used to be no law to say how far apart those slats were. Well, babies' heads would get stuck, and it was really dangerous. And so now there's a minimum or a maximum distance between slats to make those baby cribs safer. So, is that good for consumers? Absolutely. Now, people are more safe riding in cars. People are more safe putting their babies in cribs. But think about, too, the negative consequences of those regulations for the business. Yes, it's safer for us as consumers, but if you're a baby crib designer, you now have to spend more money on materials to produce your baby cribs, which is going to increase your cost of production and more expensive for you to follow those regulations. Car companies with all these new safety regulations spend a lot more money building cars. So companies often don't like these regulations, not because they want their products to be unsafe, but because they're going to have to invest more money in producing their product in order to meet the regulations that the government has set forth for them. Here's another example from 2017. We don't allow for the sale of something called raw milk. And the reason for that is because it can contain harmful things like listeria, which can kill you. So the government has regulations that we have to pasteurize our milk before we sell it, because when we don't, then there are negative consequences for the consumer. And this is another example This is about antibiotic use in beef supply chains for fast food companies. So, what they found is that when companies use antibiotics in their beef production, that can have harmful effects to their consumers. And so, you can see that there's a rating system that they gave. Chipotle's number one there. They're the A. Panera is an A minus. McDonald's and Subway moved up in the world. They're getting C's. And then you can see a whole bunch of companies down there in the F range of using antibiotics in their beef supply chain. Now, this doesn't mean that it's unsafe to eat at these businesses. It's just simply they're looking at, we are trying to regulate how many antibiotics go into the beef that we consume, and these are the companies that are doing well at that, and here are the ones that aren't. So again, like I said, sometimes companies don't like these regulations because it means that there's a lot more hoops they have to jump through, there's more money they have to spend, they have to constantly make sure that they're following what the government is telling them to do. And so a lot of times companies will push for what we call deregulation, which is the removal of some government controls over a market. And the reason for this is that it oftentimes leads to fewer and simpler regulations. And companies argue that if they have less regulations to follow, they'll be more competitive, they'll produce more goods, they'll have higher productivity, more efficiency, and lower prices. So a lot of times the higher prices get passed on to consumers when these companies have to meet all of these different regulations. And if you take those regulations off, it would make it easier for companies to produce their product, and that would make it better for the consumer. And this is really a difference in philosophy. Some people argue that more regulations are good for consumers, and some people argue that less regulations are good for consumers. So here you can see all of the regulations we have simply on a hamburger. If a restaurant is going to sell you a hamburger, here are all of the regulations they have to follow. They have to make sure that their cattle are given the growth stimulating drugs they give to their cattle need to be stopped at least 2 weeks before the cattle are slaughtered. They can't have more than 30% fat content in the beef. The lettuce must be fresh, not overgrown or ribby. Pickle slices have to be a certain thickness. Tomatoes have to be mature but not overripe. Cheese has to have 50% milk fat. The bun has to be enriched. The mayonnaise has to be seasoned or flavored, but it can't look like egg yolk. I mean, these are actual regulations over the production of each of these different products. Mayonnaise has to flow no more than 9 centimeters in 30 seconds at 69 degrees Fahrenheit if it's going to be considered grade A fancy. So 41,000 regulations that govern the sale and production of a fast food hamburger. And a lot of times, because companies are meeting all of these different regulations, the cost is passed on to the consumer. So removing these regulations could end up allowing companies to make these hamburgers for cheaper. And then you have to figure out which one outweighs the other. Would you rather have all of these regulations in place so that you know that the hamburger you're eating is totally up to standard? Or would you rather have cheaper hamburgers that are maybe following less stringent rules and regulations? So one more thing, again, to consider here are the costs and benefits. For example, the FDA allows 30% of ground coffee to consist of unripe, moldy beans, gravel, or other non-coffee impurities. And the FDA also allows certain parts per million of rodent hair, rat droppings, and insect parts in their candy bars. So why is that? Why does the FDA allow us to have rat droppings and rodent hair in our candy bars? Part of it is because it's not feasible to eliminate all of those things. If the government regulated and said, the law now says that you have to have not a single rat dropping in your candy bars, then companies wouldn't be able to exist. It's almost impossible to guarantee that every single insect hair is not going to end up there. There's going to be insects, there's going to be rodents, and as long as it's parts per million, it's not going to hurt you. And so if it's not going to hurt you to have moldy beans in some of your coffee or to have a little bit of rodent hair in your candy bar, then the government's not going to prevent it. Because if they did, it would be really hard for these companies to operate at all. So you have to find the balance between what's good for consumers, but also what's feasible for companies for them to actually run a business and operate as long as it's not harmful to the consumer. Okay, tomorrow you're going to take a look at one example of this, which is looking at the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, and looking at, is it necessary? Do we need to continue to regulate businesses to prevent pollution, or are we at a point in time where these regulations are too much for industries, and is it actually harmful to businesses and consumers by having those regulations in place? As always, feel free to either email me or call and leave me a message, and I will call you back if you have questions or there's things that you need further explanation on. And again, make sure that you've completed the notes outline for these notes and you submit them to Schoology. Have a great day. I'll talk to you soon.